They froze my salary and stock options to fund their sinking pet project. The arrogant chief executive officer smirked through the screen. Expecting tears and a tragic social media post, he thought he held all the power. What he failed to realize was that his entire digital real estate empire ran on my smart contracts. By revoking my access, he did not just fire me. He activated a protocol that would seize every single asset they owned in exactly 72 hours. Hello, listeners of Boss Revenge Stories. We are so grateful for your continued support, but unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us without an operating budget. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to cover their living expenses and keep creating these stories for you. You can support us by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the donation link in the description or the pinned comment below. My name is Kennedy Long, and this is the story of how I brought an empire to its knees. I was 32 years old and the chief integration architect of Meridian Apex, a massive corporate conglomerate that loudly prided itself on being the undisputed future of commercial real estate. I sat in my sterile, glass-walled office, staring at a monitor displaying a grid of 40 different faces on a national executive video conference call. I was quietly listening to a man who had inherited everything explain why I was suddenly worth absolutely nothing. Julian Vance, our newly minted chief executive officer, was the quintessential arrogant tech bro. He possessed a staggering amount of unearned confidence and absolutely zero understanding of the very foundation he stood upon. Kennedy, the direction of the company has changed, and you are no longer a budget priority, Julian announced, his voice oozing with a practiced, hollow corporate empathy. He was smiling. It was a faint, deeply self-satisfied smirk that barely disguised his underlying malice. He then proceeded to inform the entire National Executive Board that my salary and my heavily vested stock options were being frozen indefinitely. His official excuse was cash flow optimization. The unspoken truth was that he desperately needed my department's budget to bail out a sinking, poorly conceived artificial intelligence project spearheaded by his old college roommate, whom he had just hired as the new chief technology officer. He paused, clearly waiting for the explosion. He wanted me to cry. He wanted me to beg. Most of all, he wanted me to start shouting so he could immediately brand me as an emotional, unstable employee, thereby justifying his blatant corporate theft to the Human Resources Department. Instead, I gave him absolute, terrifying silence. I did not raise my voice. I did not slam my fists against my heavy mahogany desk. I simply moved my mouse, clicked the mute icon on my screen, and started a local screen recording to preserve his smug, triumphant face for posterity. Then, I smiled back at him. It was a genuine, warm smile. On the high-definition display, I watched at least 3 different middle managers physically shift in their seats, visibly shuddering at my calmness. They knew me well enough to realize that my total lack of resistance was infinitely more dangerous than a public meltdown. They expected a tragic resignation. They got a void. Julian honestly fancied himself a visionary real estate mogul, playing 3-dimensional chess. What he and the rest of the overpaid executive suite at Meridian Apex completely failed to comprehend was that the company's continuous flow of immense wealth had absolutely nothing to do with Julian's strategic business acumen. Meridian managed over 400 premium commercial buildings across the country. The monthly rent collection, the massive maintenance escrows, the complex tenant verifications, and the daily utility distributions ran flawlessly exclusively because of a highly sophisticated automated protocol I had meticulously designed and coded from scratch. Julian was merely the shiny hood ornament on a high-performance engine I had built with my own 2 hands. As his mouth kept moving on the screen, spouting a steady stream of meaningless corporate buzzwords, my mind drifted back 3 years. Back then, the entire executive board was caught up in a frantic, feverish frenzy to digitize their physical assets and pivot their holdings to the blockchain. They wanted it done fast, and they wanted it done cheap. During that blind rush, I authored the core digital architecture. While doing so, I quietly embedded a deep structural failsafe into the very bottom of the source code. I called it the Icarus Protocol. It was a highly specialized cross-default protection mechanism woven directly into the foundational smart contracts of the company's master ledger. The executive board, entirely blinded by the promise of a digital gold rush, blindly signed off on hundreds of pages of dense technical architecture without bothering to question or even read a single line of the smart contract logic. The Icarus Protocol contained one absolute, unbreakable core directive. If the cryptographically encrypted security token assigned to the chief architect was ever abruptly suspended, terminated, or frozen without a meticulously documented and biologically verified handover process, the system would instantly classify the event as a hostile takeover. It was originally framed as a defense against malicious external hackers, but logic does not care about job titles. Once that digital tripwire was crossed, the smart contract was programmed to automatically initiate a merciless cross-default asset seizure protocol, locking down the entire digital portfolio to prevent unauthorized extraction. By publicly freezing my compensation and plotting to revoke my access, Julian had just unknowingly pulled that exact tripwire on national television. I looked around my office one last time, taking in the framed diplomas and the sleek furniture. I reached up to my collar, slowly unclipped my plastic corporate identification badge, and dropped it onto the exact center of my desk with a soft, final clatter. I reached into my leather bag, pulled out my encrypted personal laptop, and bypassed the secondary corporate firewall to access my master control directory. With 3 steady keystrokes, I permanently severed my biometric security lock from the Meridian Apex mainframe. The digital connection died instantly. My security token evaporated into the void, leaving behind a massive, unfillable gap in the system's core registry. I closed the laptop, stood up, and walked out the door without looking back. The 72-hour countdown had officially begun. I walked into my high-rise apartment in downtown Chicago just as the late afternoon sun began casting long, golden shadows across the polished hardwood floor. The heavy silence of my living room was a stark, beautiful contrast to the hollow corporate theater I had just exited. I walked over to the mahogany bar cart, poured myself a generous measure of aged Kentucky bourbon, and savored the sharp bite of the amber liquid before stepping into my home office. I tapped the spacebar on my mechanical keyboard, waking up a secondary monitor tucked away in the shadows of my desk. A black terminal screen flickered to life, rapidly populated by cascading lines of encrypted emerald text. This was the hidden diagnostic dashboard, a covert observer node directly tied to the blockchain ledger I had constructed for the company. I leaned back in my leather chair, took a slow, deliberate sip of my drink, and simply watched. It did not take long at all. A single, pulsing red alert blinked into existence at the top left corner of the screen. The machine had finally registered that its master was gone. The first invisible gear of the Icarus Protocol had just locked into place. The terrifying beauty of a fully integrated digital ecosystem is its ruthless, unyielding efficiency. When a foundational smart contract breaks, it does not politely submit a help desk ticket or ask for human permission. It simply executes its logic and stops breathing. Nearly 800 miles away, the sun was just rising over a pristine, glass-clad Class A commercial tower in Manhattan. It was one of Meridian's crown jewels, housing some of the most aggressive and lucrative financial firms on the eastern seaboard. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, hundreds of sharply dressed employees began swiping their physical access cards at the polished security turnstiles in the grand lobby. Instead of the satisfying green flash and chirp of acceptance, they were met with flat, dead silence. The heavy smart doors remained hermetically sealed in place. The central building management system had automatically queried the blockchain for the daily maintenance budget allocation, finding a deliberately severed connection where my authentication should have been. The logic gate instantly defaulted to its absolute highest security protocol. Maintenance payment failure. Lock down the physical perimeter. Within 20 minutes, A massive sea of frustrated bankers and furious hedge fund managers were stranded in the marble lobby, shouting aggressively at helpless security guards who possessed zero manual override privileges. The panic rippled upward through the corporate hierarchy, hitting the Meridian IT help desk by 9 o'clock. Through my network monitoring tools, I watched a nervous senior systems administrator escalate the Manhattan lockout directly to the executive suite. Julian received the urgent notification while he was likely sipping a $20 artisanal latte in his pristine corner office. His response was entirely predictable and painfully arrogant. He dismissed the frantic IT report with a single, annoyed internal message. He told his engineering staff to stop bothering him with minor, localized software glitches and ordered a hard global reset of the local servers. He fundamentally assumed that enterprise technology was just a magic box that occasionally needed to be turned off and on again. He had absolutely no idea that restarting those servers was the equivalent of throwing a bucket of water onto a raging grease fire. The mandated system reboot forced a global synchronization check across all 400 of their managed properties. That forced synchronization was the exact catalyst required for the next catastrophic phase. Down in Texas, a massive multi-use commercial complex was scheduled to execute its automated monthly rent distribution. Exactly $14 million had been automatically collected overnight from retail tenants and was queued in a holding state, ready to be routed into Meridian's primary operational bank account. But the smart contract governing that specific transaction hit a newly formed cryptographic wall. The Icarus protocol intercepted the routing command right at the gateway. The digital logic was flawless and completely devoid of emotion. The chief architect was missing. Therefore, the corporate entity was inherently compromised. To protect the assets from what it perceived as a hostile extraction, the protocol diverted the entire $14 million straight into a decentralized escrow wallet. It was a digital vault suspended in the blockchain ether, completely stripped of any human administrative access or recovery keys. Meridian Apex had just lost its primary cash injection for the quarter in a fraction of a second, and nobody in their bloated accounting department had even noticed the missing capital yet. I watched the transaction hash confirm on my screen, permanently solidifying the massive transfer. The system was meticulously polite, always programmed to leave a pristine paper trail, precisely 2 seconds after the money vanished into the untouchable escrow. An automated alert was generated and dispatched straight to the shared inbox of Meridian's legal department. The subject line was unassumingly bland. The body of the email contained a single, highly specific string of text. Error 404. Chief Architect Authentication Not Found. Asset allocation suspended. It sat there in the digital dark, buried under dozens of petty vendor disputes and mundane daily compliance newsletters. The corporate attorneys, entirely comfortable in their routine ignorance, ignored the notification completely. Not a single highly paid lawyer would bother to open that message until it was far too late to stop the bleeding. The red alerts on my monitor began to multiply rapidly, spreading like a vicious infection through a central nervous system. 2 more premium properties in Seattle reported localized power rationing. A massive logistics hub in Atlanta suddenly failed to process any incoming digital freight manifests. The dominoes were falling, silently and rhythmically in the background, but I did not type a single line of code to accelerate the damage. I did not send a mocking, triumphant email or prepare a lengthy list of financial demands. I simply reached forward and turned off my monitor. I went down to my building's private gym and pushed myself through an intense, agonizing 90-minute workout, letting the heavy physical exertion burn off the very last traces of my lingering corporate adrenaline. Afterward, I took a long, boiling hot shower, dressed in elegant evening wear, and took myself out to dinner at my absolute favorite Italian restaurant overlooking the dark, winding river. I ordered the most expensive bottle of vintage red wine on the menu and slowly enjoyed a perfect plate of white truffle pasta. When I finally returned to my quiet apartment, I climbed into my luxurious bed and slept a deep, completely dreamless sleep for exactly 8 hours. There was absolutely no need for me to intervene or micromanage the destruction. My enemies were blind, arrogant, and currently marching themselves willingly toward the gallows. All I had to do was step back and let them tie the knot around their own necks. Thursday morning arrived with the subtlety of a swinging sledgehammer. At precisely 9 o'clock, the private phone on Julian's massive desk began to ring. It was not an internal corporate extension. It was a direct emergency line from their primary third-party auditing firm in Boston. The lead auditor did not bother with the usual polite morning pleasantries. He bluntly informed Julian that Meridian Apex had just violently breached 3 major corporate debt covenants. The liquidity pools spanning their southern, eastern, and midwestern commercial sectors had suddenly and inexplicably flatlined overnight. The massive cash flow was not merely delayed, it was completely invisible to the central banking sector. The auditor firmly warned that if the required operational liquidity was not restored within 24 hours, the institutional banks would automatically classify the entire corporate loan portfolio as completely defaulted. Down the hall, completely unaware of the auditor's threat, Marcus, the head of the legal department, was angrily scrolling through his overflowing inbox. He was desperately searching for an external software vendor to blame for the catastrophic Manhattan building lockout the day before. As his eyes scanned the digital clutter, they caught a deeply buried message from an automated internal system address. He opened it and read the single line of text regarding the missing authentication token of the chief architect. A sudden, freezing pit formed in his stomach. Marcus frantically logged into the secure legal archives and pulled up the original digital architectural documents from 3 years ago. His eyes darted across the dense technical jargon until he found the appendix clearly labeled as the Icarus Protocol. As a corporate lawyer, he understood aggressive contracts, but as he slowly parsed the plain English translation of the embedded smart contract logic, all the blood drained from his face. It was a merciless cross-default mechanism. He realized with absolute paralyzing horror exactly what was happening to their network. A freeze on one isolated asset automatically triggered a cascading lockdown on the next adjacent asset. It was a highly aggressive digital virus designed specifically to protect the host by systematically shutting down the entire nervous system, because the Texas funds were currently locked in untouchable escrow. The protocol was actively moving to seize the collateral assets tied to those specific properties to balance the ledger. Marcus grabbed the heavy printed pages and sprinted down the pristine corridor, bursting into Julian's office and slamming the heavy glass door shut behind him. He threw the documents onto the polished wood, shouting that the company was rapidly bleeding out from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Julian's initial reaction was loud, aggressive denial. His fragile ego simply refused to accept that his multi-billion-dollar real estate empire was rapidly crumbling simply because he had tried to humiliate one woman. In a frantic, desperate bid to regain control of his kingdom, Julian immediately authorized a massive emergency expenditure. He flew in an elite team of Silicon Valley white-hat hackers, paying them an absurd hourly rate to crack the mainframe and aggressively bypass the rogue smart contracts. They quickly set up a chaotic war room in the main executive conference center. For 4 grueling hours, they typed frantically across dozens of monitors, running highly sophisticated bypass algorithms to break the blockchain logic. By early afternoon, the lead security engineer walked into Julian's office, looking completely exhausted and utterly defeated. The hacker grimly explained that the encryption was mathematically unbreakable from the outside. The core architecture of the protocol was inextricably tied to a highly complex cryptographic hardware key. It was a physical, encrypted flash drive that I had casually dropped into my leather purse before walking out of the building. The engineer bluntly stated that without inserting that specific piece of hardware into the primary server rack, attempting to brute force the smart contract would take their fastest supercomputers roughly 10,000 years. The absolute failure of the external security experts shattered the final illusion of executive control. Whispers of the catastrophic system failure began to echo rapidly through the pristine corridors of the corporate headquarters. The hushed rumors quickly mutated into sheer, unadulterated panic. The corporate credit cards suddenly stopped working at lunch. The automated expense reimbursement system crashed. The realization heavily set in that the cash flow optimization Julian had so proudly announced actually meant the sudden, violent death of the entire corporation. The very same middle managers who had smirked and nodded approvingly during my public humiliation were now sweating profusely in their custom-tailored suits. In the break rooms and emergency stairwells, terrified executives were frantically refreshing their web browsers, secretly updating their digital resumes, and quietly calling corporate headhunters. The atmosphere inside the building rapidly transformed from a bastion of arrogant superiority into the suffocating, primal terror of a rapidly sinking ship, miles away from the absolute chaos I had meticulously orchestrated. I sat comfortably by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my high-rise apartment. The sky over Chicago had turned a deep, bruised gray, and heavy rain was violently streaking across the thick glass. On the marble coffee table right beside me, my smartphone lit up with a relentless, frantic rhythm. The screen displayed a continuous, desperate stream of incoming notifications. There were exactly 15 missed calls from the Human Resources Department, leaving voicemails begging for a polite, highly compensated exit interview. There were 8 increasingly frantic voicemails from Marcus, his tone dramatically shifting from making authoritative legal demands to offering desperate pleas for a quick technical consultation. And finally, there were 3 direct, back-to-back calls from Julian himself. I did not move a single muscle to answer any of them. I kept the device locked on absolute silent mode. I took a slow, calming sip of hot black tea, savoring the pleasant warmth spreading through my chest, and simply watched the heavy rain wash over the sprawling city below. I was thoroughly enjoying the exquisite, beautiful silence of their utter helplessness. They had arrogantly stripped me of my financial value in a crowded virtual room, and now they were screaming desperately into a massive void that I had completely and permanently soundproofed. Friday morning broke over the city like a heavy, suffocating shroud. By 8 o'clock, the atmosphere inside the main executive conference room at Meridian Apex resembled the chaotic triage center of a sinking battleship. It was exactly 4 hours before the Icarus Protocol would finalize its execution phase and officially transfer all collateral assets to the creditors. The National Board of Directors had flown in overnight on emergency private charters. These were men and women who usually moved with untouchable, predatory grace. Now, they were a pathetic collection of wrinkled designer suits and pale, deeply terrified faces. They clutched cold cups of coffee with trembling hands, their eyes darting wildly around the room as if expecting the walls to physically collapse. Marcus stood at the head of the long mahogany table, clutching a dry erase marker like it was his only lifeline. He had spent the entire night tearing through the digital ledgers and the original blockchain architecture documents. His tie was loosened, his hair was a messy, sweaty tangle, and his voice cracked with severe dehydration. He began furiously drawing interlocking flowcharts on the massive white board, trying to visualize a digital execution that none of them could physically touch. "It is completely ironclad," Marcus rasped, slamming his hand against the board. Every single line of the smart contract was legally authorized. "Julian, your digital signature is stamped on the primary execution block from 3 years ago. We literally gave the system the legal right to liquidate us in the event of an unauthorized security breach." The room erupted into a cacophony of frantic, overlapping shouts. A senior board member from Chicago stood up, his face purple with rage, demanding to know how they could legally stop a computer program. Marcus yelled back over the noise, his voice echoing with absolute desperation. "We cannot stop it. The blockchain does not care about injunctions or restraining orders. It only recognizes mathematical truth. If Kennedy does not physically insert her encrypted hardware key and biometrically authenticate the master ledger before 12 noon today, the protocol will automatically forfeit our control over exactly 80% of our core commercial portfolio. We will lose the buildings, we will lose the cash reserves, and we will be fundamentally bankrupt by lunchtime." The horrifying reality of the timeline sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the room. Julian was slumped in his high-backed leather chair, staring blankly at the floor. The arrogant smirk that had defined his entire persona was completely gone, replaced by a hollow, sickening realization that his legacy was evaporating. Recognizing that intimidation, legal threats, and technical force had all spectacularly failed, Julian violently pivoted to the only weapon he actually understood: money. He suddenly shot out of his chair, slamming both hands on the table, and pointed a shaking finger at the Director of Human Resources. "Draft a new contract," Julian screamed, his voice pitching into a hysterical frequency. "Give her whatever she wants. Offer her 10 times her previous base salary. Give her the title of Executive Vice President of Digital Architecture. Hell, give her unrestricted board-level stock options and a massive signing bonus. Just get it in writing and send it to her personal email right now. We will buy her back." It was a beautifully pathetic display of corporate desperation. They genuinely believed that every single person had a price, and that throwing massive sums of fictional, soon-to-be worthless money at me would instantly cure the terminal cancer they had injected into their own company. From the quiet sanctuary of my apartment, I watched their frantic digital movements. I could see the massive, chaotic spikes in their internal network traffic. I knew exactly what they were doing. They were scrambling, screaming, and bleeding out. I sat comfortably at my desk, sipping a fresh glass of sparkling water, watching the digital clock on my monitor tick closer to the absolute edge. I waited until the psychological pressure reached its absolute maximum threshold. I wanted the fear to marinate deep inside their bones. At exactly 11:30, with only 30 minutes left on the execution timer, I finally broke my silence. I composed a remarkably short email and addressed it directly to Julian, copying the entire board of directors and the legal department. There were no demands. There were no negotiations. The body of the email contained absolutely no text, only a single, heavily encrypted hyperlink to a secure video conferencing server I had hosted externally. I was not going to step foot inside their building to save them. If they wanted a resolution, I was going to force the most powerful executives in the country to kneel before me through a glowing screen. Inside the boardroom, the notification chime echoed like a gunshot. Julian practically dove across the table to click the link, his hands shaking so violently he missed the mouse twice. The massive projector screen at the end of the conference room flickered to life. The entire board held their collective breath, leaning forward, desperately expecting my face to appear so they could immediately begin showering me with their fabricated wealth and hollow apologies. But my camera was completely disabled. Instead of my face, the massive projector screen was filled entirely by a pitch-black background. In the dead center of the darkness, a gigantic, glowing red digital countdown timer was ticking away the final minutes and seconds with absolute, unyielding precision. Below the violently ticking numbers, in a stark, cold font, rested a single, devastating sentence: irreversible condition. The collective gasp of horror in the boardroom was palpable even through my muted speakers. They had logged in expecting a desperate negotiation. Instead, they walked straight into a psychological slaughterhouse. The trap had firmly snapped shut, and they were finally forced to watch their own execution in real time. The red digital numbers on their massive projector screen ticked relentlessly downward. 22 minutes, 21 minutes. The heavy silence in the boardroom was broken only by the ragged, uneven breathing of the most powerful executives in commercial real estate. I let them stare at the abyss for exactly 5 agonizing minutes before I finally reached forward and enabled my web camera. The contrast between the two video feeds was stark and almost comical. On their end, the high-definition corporate lens captured a chaotic, sweating mass of ruined elite. Ties were aggressively loosened, hair was pulled in sheer panic, and Julian Vance looked absolutely physically ill. His usually perfectly tanned face was now a sickly ashen gray, and his expensive designer shirt was soaked in cold sweat. On my end, the frame was completely still. I sat casually in my softly lit home office, dressed in a simple, comfortable gray knit sweater. My hair was tied back in a loose, effortless knot. I held a large, warm mug of dark black coffee in my hands. My facial expression was completely blank, entirely devoid of the sudden anger or the smug, gloating triumph they had so desperately expected to see. I looked at them the same way one might passively observe a minor traffic accident on a distant highway. Julian immediately lunged closer to the boardroom microphone, aggressively trying to salvage whatever shreds of authority he still possessed. He forced a strained, sickening smile, attempting to play the role of the magnanimous, forgiving leader offering a generous truce to a difficult subordinate. "Kennedy, we can all take a step back here," Julian pleaded, his voice trembling violently despite his absolute best efforts to sound commanding. "This little incident has obviously gone way too far. The board recognizes your value. Just tell me exactly how much money you want to stop this right now, and we will wire it immediately. Name your absolute price. We can fix this together." I did not answer right away. I slowly brought the ceramic mug to my lips and took a long, deliberate sip of the bitter black coffee. The simple, domestic sound of the ceramic settling gently against my wooden desk echoed like a deafening thunderclap inside their dead silent conference room. "Do you honestly think this is a negotiation, Julian?" I finally spoke, my voice a flat, emotionless current that sliced cleanly through his desperate corporate posturing. "You do not negotiate with gravity when you step off a cliff. You arrogantly chose to freeze the lifeblood of this entire digital ecosystem. When you freeze the blood, the tissue automatically necrotizes. I do not have the right, nor the inclination, to interfere with the fundamental laws of digital nature." My absolute detachment shattered whatever fragile restraint remained in the room. Marcus, the head of the legal department, suddenly pushed his way violently past the frantic board members. His face was contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated legal fury. He practically screamed directly into the boardroom camera, pointing a shaking finger at my calm face. "You are intentionally destroying a multi-billion-dollar corporation," Marcus roared, his voice cracking under the immense psychological pressure. "I will personally see to it that you face catastrophic civil and criminal liability for this digital terrorism. We will ruin your entire life. You will spend the rest of your pathetic existence rotting in a federal prison." For the very first time since the video call began, the corners of my mouth twitched upward into a very small, utterly chilling smile. I did not raise my voice to match his hysterical screaming. Instead, I calmly moved my mouse and clicked the screen share icon. The massive projector in their boardroom immediately switched from the terrifying red countdown timer to a crisp, high-resolution image of a deeply buried legal document. It was the master architectural agreement from 3 years ago, featuring Julian's unmistakable, certified digital signature proudly stamped at the very bottom. I used my digital cursor to highlight a very specific, heavily bolded section hidden deep within the dense technical appendix. "I strongly suggest you read Clause 4.2. "Marcus," I said softly, allowing the words to hang heavily in the tense air. Marcus squinted at the massive screen, his pale lips moving silently as he frantically read the highlighted text, the color completely drained from his face for the second time that morning. The clause was beautifully simple and incredibly devastating. It explicitly stated a total personal liability exemption for the chief architect in the specific event of an improper or undocumented contract termination initiated by the board of directors. They had legally indemnified me against any and all damages caused by their own impulsive administrative actions, by freezing my compensation and locking me out, without following their own mandated biometric handover protocols. They had fully authorized the system's defensive destruction and legally shielded me from every single consequence. They had handed me a loaded weapon, told me to point it at their heads, and signed a legally binding waiver clearing me of murder. Marcus physically collapsed into a nearby leather chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. The fight completely left his body. He knew it was mathematically and legally over. The digital clock in the corner of my screen ticked down to exactly 1 minute remaining, 60 seconds until the total corporate liquidation was permanently finalized. Julian completely lost his mind. He violently slammed both of his fists onto the mahogany table, screaming incoherently like a petulant child. He turned to the terrified IT director shivering in the corner of the room and began furiously ordering him to run down to the basement server room and physically rip the power cords out of the wall. It was the desperate, pathetic command of a man who fundamentally did not understand the technology he claimed to rule. Unplugging a localized server does absolutely nothing to stop a decentralized blockchain. The ledger existed everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. It was immortal, and it was entirely out of his physical reach. I sat back and watched Julian hyperventilate, his pristine corporate empire crumbling into digital dust right in front of his eyes. I reached forward, hovering my mouse directly over the glowing red disconnect button on my application. "Enjoy your cash flow optimization, Julian," I whispered softly into the microphone. Then, I clicked the button, permanently severing the connection and plunging their boardroom back into complete and total darkness. At exactly 12 noon, the heavy silence inside the Meridian Apex headquarters was broken by the simultaneous, synchronized clicking of hundreds of hard drives and server relays powering down. Across the entire country, every single monitor connected to the corporate mainframe flashed a brilliant, blinding white for a fraction of a second before plunging into absolute darkness. When the screens slowly flickered back to life, the familiar blue corporate logos were completely gone. The global dashboard, once proudly displaying the vast wealth of a real estate empire, now showed a single, terrifying column of data. The ownership status of 400 premium commercial properties simultaneously shifted from owned to foreclosed. In that exact fraction of a second, thousands of highly lucrative commercial lease contracts were permanently overwritten. The digital pipes that once pumped millions of dollars of daily rent into Meridian's primary banking accounts were violently rerouted, locking the massive revenue streams into a new, untouchable destination. Julian sat completely paralyzed in the dark boardroom as his smartphone buzzed one final time. It was an automated legal notice from the blockchain ledger, officially confirming the successful execution of the cross-default asset transfer. With a trembling finger, he opened the digital document to see exactly which institutional bank was violently ripping his empire away from him, but the name listed as the primary, undisputed creditor was not a massive Wall Street bank or a ruthless foreign private equity firm. The document clearly stated that all seized collateral assets were now the exclusive legal property of the Obsidian Tech Investment Fund. Julian stared at the name, his mind desperately struggling to comprehend the reality. Obsidian Tech was not a bank. It was a private, highly secretive corporate shell company that I had quietly incorporated exactly 3 years ago during the chaotic frenzy of the initial digital migration, when the board of directors blindly signed off on my massive stacks of technical architecture. I had seamlessly woven Obsidian Tech into the foundational smart contracts as the ultimate third-party guarantor of the entire network. By deliberately freezing my compensation and plotting to steal my department's budget, Julian Vance had not just triggered a defensive lockdown, he had unknowingly executed the very specific legal clause that instantly elevated my private holding company to the status of the highest priority secured creditor. In his arrogant attempt to save a few $1,000,000, he had literally handed me the keys to his entire multi-billion-dollar kingdom. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the news of the catastrophic digital foreclosure leaked to the public markets. Meridian Apex went completely bankrupt in the blink of an eye, and their publicly traded stock violently plummeted to absolute zero. Later that exact same afternoon, the terrified board of directors convened an emergency session in a hotel lobby and immediately terminated Julian with extreme prejudice. He was unceremoniously escorted out of the building by the very same security guards he used to belittle. By evening, federal regulators were already circling, preparing a massive indictment against him for blatantly deceiving his shareholders and recklessly destroying a publicly traded entity. The major financial media networks spent the entire weekend running breathless segments about the historic collapse, unanimously dubbing his arrogant mistake as the billion-dollar slip-up. Exactly 1 week later, I walked through the towering glass doors of the building that used to serve as the Meridian Apex Global Headquarters. The grand marble lobby was completely silent, entirely emptied of the arrogant executives who used to roam its halls. I did not walk in as an employee. I walked in as the sole, undisputed owner of the physical building and the entire digital empire it housed. I took the private elevator all the way up to the executive suite and strolled slowly past Julian's dark, empty office. I stopped by my old mahogany desk, reached into my pocket, and pulled out my old corporate identification badge. I dropped the useless piece of plastic into the wastebasket, letting it fall with a satisfying thud. A sharply dressed young assistant quietly approached, handing me a crystal flute filled with chilled, vintage champagne. I took a slow, refreshing sip, looking out over the sprawling city skyline that now belonged entirely to me. I turned to my new assistant with a warm, genuine smile. "Please contact the maintenance crew," I said softly. "It is time to start clearing out the rest of the trash." Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please let me know your city or country in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey and found it entertaining, please consider supporting our channel with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the donation QR code on your screen, or by clicking the secure donation link provided in the video description and the pinned comment. Your incredible generosity directly pays the salaries of the hardworking team behind this channel, helping them feed their families and allowing us to continue creating and sharing these wonderful stories with all of you. Thank you again, and have a beautiful day.